Hello, everyone, and welcome to the University of Iowa Virtual Visiting Artist Interview Series. My name is Andrew Casto, and I'm here today with Naomi Dalglish, coming to us from North Carolina. Naomi is a potter at Bandana Pottery, and she began making pottery with her grandmother as a child. She studied clay at Earlham College with Mike Thiedemann, and eventually spent a semester in Mexico studying with Mexican potters, and wound up at Penland after undergrad, where she met her partner, Michael Hunt, at a workshop there. And together they are operating Bandana Pottery presently near, is it Baker's? What's the town name?
Bakersville, North Carolina.
Bakersville, North Carolina. Yeah, great. Naomi, thanks so much, and welcome. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Andrew.
I've been asking people to sort of start with a description of how they began working in clay. And I said, I guess, a little bit of that in your bio, but could you maybe tell us a little bit more about what that was like?
Yeah, so my grandmother was a high school art teacher, and I would spend a week or two every summer with her and my grandfather, and she had a studio in her basement with a wheel and a kiln. So that was sort of my introduction to pottery, and just sort of knowing that I liked making things out of clay.
Yeah.
And my dad, that was my mom's mom, and my dad's sister was also a ceramic artist who mostly made sculptures in her career, but we grew up in my house with a bunch of pots that either my grandmother had made or that my aunt had made when she was an undergrad. And so I was just very familiar with having pots as a part of our life. And so when I got to Earlham College, I really kind of lucked into Ceramics 1 my first semester, just kind of feeling like it would be a somewhat familiar place to be in an unfamiliar new setting of college. And my teacher there, who you also know, Mike Thiedemann, was a really great teacher. We were so lucky in that program to be able to make our own clay and fire the wood kiln and the gas kiln on our own. And so it was a really great sort of experiential learning experience. And so I ended up majoring in art and focusing on ceramics at Earlham. And by the end of my time there, I pretty much knew that I wanted to continue a life in clay in some way. And found myself at Penland not long after, taking a kiln building class there, and met my now husband Michael, who had been in the area on and off for quite a while, also involved with Penland, and we started building a wood kiln together. He had actually started building it during the class that I was taking, and so I was kind of playing hooky from the class to come help build the kiln. And then after the class was over, he said, well, I kind of made a kiln that's a little bit too big for me to fill. Can you like stay and help make pots to fill it and fire? And then I never left. So
awesome.
Yeah.
And I should say for our viewers, Naomi and I went to undergraduate school together. So we both had Mike Thiedemann as a professor, and like you, Naomi, like he's the reason that I do this, and really sort of showed me, I guess, a way of thinking about clay and thinking about art that made it accessible and interesting, and sort of opened that door for me. So I assume maybe he'll watch this if I post it on Facebook, because we're both here. So I just wanted to say, hey, Mike, and thanks so much, as always. So yeah, it was an amazing place and an amazing time. And I guess it's funny because we haven't talked really since then, but I've always been sort of keeping an eye on your work and following what thanks. I mean, it's just awesome. Like there's this tiny little community of people from that place, and so many people from ceramics proper or presently, sort of came out of that little program.
It's true. Yeah, it's an amazing community of people that were students there.
Where did you grow up? You mentioned your grandmother, but before that, where were you living?
I grew up in Bloomington, Indiana,
Oh,
so not
Indiana.
too far from Richmond, where Earlham is, and my grandparents live in Pittsburgh.
Okay. And then you talk about, having other relatives that are artists and involved in clay and a sort of a performing arts family in a lot of ways too. So you were raised with this kind of sensibility or?
Yeah, definitely incorporating music and visual art into our lives in a kind of ordinary way, I guess.
Yeah. What was it like starting the pottery in the beginning with Michael? I always wonder about those times. And also, since a lot of our audience will be students,
Right.
I think it's really helpful to sort of hear, the steps that it took to get you to
Yeah.
where you are now.
Yeah, I know. And it's interesting. We were just talking about like how long ago it was that we were at Earlham, 20 years, which is maybe I shouldn't have revealed that fact.
I said it
I
too.
feel like I always kind of have to give that caveat now when I talk about how we got started, because things are so different now than even they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I know that for us, for instance, we sort of are, a lot of our pottery mentors and teachers had taken this route of living in kind of rural areas that were relatively affordable, and that being like one of the strategies for how to be able to especially get started
Yeah.
in a crazy business like this. And that is what we did, and that was really helpful, keeping our living costs super low.
Yeah.
Which of course, even now trying to get set up in the same place is not as cheap as it was
Right.
then. So I acknowledge that that's like a challenge that people have now, even more so.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of people since then that have started doing more of the urban pottery thing with shared studio spaces, and that's really cool too. But so the way that we got started was squatting in this barn. Actually, belonged to a woman that worked at Penland, and she wasn't using it, and she told Michael that he could work in it as a studio. And so the downstairs of it, he just insulated part of it with clay and straw cob, and that was his tiny studio. And then when I moved, I converted the indoor porch of our rental house into a studio. Mm-hmm. And he started building this kiln on property that we didn't own. And as I said, it turned out to be bigger than he had originally imagined. And I'm sure the owner of the house too was a little surprised. Yeah. But things ended up working out. She's realized a couple of years later that the country life wasn't quite for her, and we bought the property and the house that now has the studio and kiln on it. And everything, we've just always kind of gone sort of step by step, and we're able to not go into a crazy amount of debt getting started, which definitely helped relieve the stresses of, those kinds of financial burdens. So there were definitely a lot of years where we would make some pots really fast and then go to a show and then come back and like go to the hardware store and spend like all of the money that we had just made to like start renovating the studio, and kind of do that over and over again for a year or two until even now, it's just sort of everything that's here has been a process of, over the past, I guess, 16 years, slowly adding on bit by bit. And of course, we look around and still see millions of things we'd still love to do.
I still do, yeah. It's an amazing story, and I feel like it's so much of what students ask me. Like they want to know like how they can make it work to have a life in art, and I think it's different depending on the medium or the style of what a person is wanting to do. But like I just always try to tell people that it's possible, like if a person is driven, and it's more possible for some people than others, of course. Like it's hard work and it like takes being committed. Like then the trade-off is you get to have this awesome lifestyle doing what you love doing, right? And I don't know, I just think it's hard because there's so many pressures to like have everything in line right when people are done with school or right when they're out in the real world. And it's like almost nobody is ready to jump right into an active producing lifestyle as an artist after 4 years of college or even after 3 more years of grad school. Like you need time to like build these things up.
And I think that now more than ever, there's the additional challenge with the way that we perceive the world through social media is that there's all these people that have this very finished product that's just ready to present to the world. And I think that that is a very false perception, not only of people at the beginning of their careers, but even now. I mean, we still come to the studio every day and have our own failures and that aren't as easy to like show on social media or to talk about in a really in-depth way. I mean, I think that's something this or a workshop or more in-depth teaching session can maybe portray a little bit more readily. But I think the main thing that I would recommend to people that are trying to figure out their next step or at any point in your creative life is just to keep figuring out ways to just keep making what you want to make.
Yes.
There's a lot of pressure to figure out how to brand yourself or to present yourself to the world, and all of those things, while they can be important in a way, are definitely secondary to like your heart's passion of exploring your creative work. So for just like one example, sort of early on when I first came here, I had a part-time job at the coffee shop at Penland. And at a certain point, I just sort of realized even that part-time job was keeping me out of the studio enough that I felt like I was not really able to get into a groove. And luckily I was in a situation in which, like I said, our expenses here were so low that I realized that with just kind of maybe living even a little bit more simply, I could just like quit that job for a while. And just so I could be part-time in the studio or full-time in the studio and not have to split my time up as much. And that really did end up being a beneficial decision for me, because that's what I needed to be able to get myself going enough to really turn it into more of a livelihood for myself.
Yeah, and I know of no problem in art that's not made better by make more work.
Yeah.
Often people hit these walls, and I do too myself, and like it can be so challenging to get in the studio when things aren't right, or when like circumstances in life are hard, or even just like when you're like on, I don't know, sometimes I get sort of just in a funk about the work I'm making.
Yeah, it is so much more easily said than done. It does sound like a simple thing. Well, just keep making stuff. But yeah, like you say, it can be really hard for a variety of reasons at different times. I think for me, one of the things that I do, we often work in these sort of long cycles where we're making for 2 months, and then we go to a show, and then we come back and we have to deal with all of the other life things that we sort of let fall by the wayside while we were so busy. And then it can be a little bit hard to get back into the studio and get into the groove. So in those situations, a lot of times I'll just sort of start making something that feels a little bit less like there's not as many decisions to make, but that I know is something I enjoy doing. And then usually just by the doing of it, I start to, there's like a little hook somewhere. Like,
what
that's what I want to.
I'm curious, what objects are those for you that are like if you're going to pick something like that? Well, a lot of times for me,
like making mugs or some bowls off the hump that are just sort of something that I know that I always want to have. And mugs are kind of nice because it's such, I mean, sometimes I'll make more complicated forms, but a lot of them are pretty simple. So it's a lot more just about like the touching of the clay and sort of simple gestures and getting into that rhythm, and not as much about like formal decisions while I'm throwing.
Yeah.
Or like even technically difficult, because that could be a hard thing to do on your first day back in the studio, is trying to throw some pictures or something that half of them are gonna collapse anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then handles, I really like making handles, and that's kind of a slow thing, but also very satisfying little puzzle of a project.
Yeah. I love handles also. And I can attest, can I show them this mug?
Sure.
I'm sorry. You're probably like embarrassed by this. I have a Naomi Dalglish mug from probably 1999 that I'm drinking my coffee out of right here, maybe 2000. And the handle is really good. Like, I mean, I remember at the time being like, oh, that fits my hand. And it's still, other parts of me may have changed since like, 2000, but hand seems to be about the same.
Yeah. And what's kind of cool to me to seeing that is, I think my handles have kind of changed more in the years since, but the form of that mug is still, the basic bones of things that I'm still making. I mean, I know it's a really simple form, but the way that it kind of comes in a little bit, maybe about 2/3 of the way up, and then the rim kind of comes in just a little. Yeah, it's just kind of cool to see that I guess we keep thinking, oh, I'm doing totally different things, but I guess there is an eye or something there that is still
Yeah. I mean, I gotta say, like, I have a lot of mugs. Not a lot of them are this like old for me, like there aren't a lot that have made it. Maybe they've been broken, or, a kid has like pushed them off the table by accident or whatever. But like this one has really stayed like in regular use all this time. So it's got a nice, like, I'd show you, but there's coffee in it. It's got a nice like coffee patina inside it. So
awesome.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a great thing to have, and it's cool to see that it's like not that distant from what you're still doing in a lot of ways. What about, can you talk some about the clay you guys are using? I mean, I know that you're getting clay from around your property, right? And I mean, for people watching, you should really check out their Instagram and website, because there are all sorts of amazing videos and sort of details of where you're getting it, but and the processing of it. But could you maybe just like give us a little brief walkthrough of that?
Yeah. So we do use wild local clays. 75%, well, no, wait, 50% of our clay body comes from just about a mile down the road. It's a red clay that is very coarse, and all around this area where we are here in Western North Carolina, they mine feldspar, and decomposed feldspar is kaolin, which is one of the main ingredients of porcelain. So our red clay is basically, like, we almost sometimes call it like a red porcelain, because it's this very refractory stoneware temperature clay that has iron in it. So even though we often think of red clays as being earthenware, we actually have to add some materials like feldspar to it to help it vitrify at stoneware temperatures. Like if we just put a lump of our clay here in the kiln, it would not hold water. So we use that clay, and then also another clay that comes from a little further down the mountain, closer to Asheville, that is because it's maybe more of a secondary clay deposit, which means the clay particles from the mountains being filtered down by rivers and streams and deposited down in riverbanks. It's a bit finer and a little bit more plastic.
Nice.
Whereas the clays up here tend to, I mean, this is obviously extremely overly simplified geology 101, but the clays up here tend to be primary clays, which are just like rocks that have decomposed in place. So what we do is we take those two clays that together make up 75% of our clay body, and we mix them into a slip, and then we screen them into a big feed tank through a variety of different kinds of screens. And if you were here at my studio, I would take you and show you all this, but like you said, Andrew, there's pictures on Instagram and our website about this process. But yeah, those screens that we are using we kind of consider in some ways like one of the first aesthetic decisions that we're making while we're making the clay is choosing how big that screen is, because that's determining the size of the particles that we're leaving in the clay that are going to form that landscape underneath our slips and glaze, because we layer a lot of slips and glaze over this coarse dark clay. So that's a lot of the kind of decoration that we're playing with, is that coarse dark clay sort of glowing through those other layers. But then to that slip that we've just screened, we add 25% more of commercial bagged materials like feldspar and silica to help the glaze fit, and a little bit more sand and a little more ball clay. And then we pump that, it's still pretty much a slurry, into drying racks that are lined with bed sheets. And those, it just stays outside covered until it's working consistency. And then we bring it into the studio.
Yeah. How long do they, does it sit in the bed sheets before it's ready to use?
Yeah, it really depends on the weather.
Sure.
If it's like super rainy, humid summertime, it can take like 4 or 5 weeks. And actually the fastest drying happens when there's a lot of like freezing and thawing during wintertime, because the freezing will sort of make these ice channels that the water will flow out of. And that's actually totally fine when it's drying, as long as we can catch it still at working consistency. We can bring it back into the studio and wedge it or put it through the pug mill. And it's not until, after it's pugged, or of course, if it's a pot, then you wouldn't want it to freeze. But during the drying process, it's actually
you can manage
helpful.
it. Yeah. What about, so I also wanted to ask about the surfaces. You talked about slips and glazes that you're using, and there was something that I saw somewhere about the work talking about like a layer of iron, like an iron wash that you're putting on top of the glazes.
Oh yeah.
I was really curious about just like how that changes things or affects things.
Right. Well, if you want, I could actually do a very quick little demo, because that's what I've been doing today, is glazing those pots. But I can tell you, let me just see if I have, it would be nice if I could show you what it looks like after it's fired, but I don't see a finished one right here. But this is, that is the pot. The red clay pot has a white slip over it and a clear glaze, and then one of the kinds of decoration that we do is with wax resist, and then over the glaze, and then an iron wash over that. So that's sort of even more layering, but it's a really fun, I love making these wax resist patterns, because it really makes you think in terms of these sort of positive, negative, interacting shapes. And it's kind of a fun puzzle. And then it always feels kind of like magic when you end up just washing the iron wash over the wax, because it's like reveals the pattern. So let me see what I'll do this one. So these pots have already been slipped and glazed, and I just put the wax on them this afternoon. And all the pots, we bone dry glaze our pots, so they're once fired mostly, which is a lot of our glazes are ash glazes, so that makes it a little bit easier to bone dry slip. So let's see, didn't really figure this out. Right now I'm just doing the back.
Yeah, no, this is great. You're the first person to do a demo in this format.
Well, it's just lucky that you asked that question, and that's what I just happened to be doing.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
And this is also kind of like the most bang for your buck for like a super short demo because it's very dramatic.
Yeah.
Because I already did all of the hard work. So you can kind of see the wax that's painted.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't really have this set up so great for video, but.
Yeah, this is great. And so the iron areas, I assume, will be darker than.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, where it's sticking everywhere that the wax wasn't painted.
Yeah.
And then this is actually kind of a new iron wash that we've been playing with that's a little bit blacker. We've often done it with an iron wash that is more brown. This is right now, it's really red, but where it's red will be sort of more of a, basically black. Yeah, so that's what I get to do later tonight after the kids are in bed, because we're going to try and load another kiln tomorrow.
Nice. And you said you just fired your other kiln yesterday or recently? Yeah,
we have two kilns that we fire, that we do our glaze firing in, and one of them is a quite large cross draft. They're both wood kilns. The big one it's based on a Thai style of kiln, which it's a big tube, but it's wide and tall in the front, and it tapers as it goes towards the back. So that design is intended to fire relatively quickly, as opposed to an anagama, which would fire a lot more slowly, with the intention of lots of wood ash buildup, sort of forming its own surface. But since we're glazing and decorating most of our pots, we're interested in a shorter firing where we're getting the atmospheric effects of a wood kiln, but not just tons and tons of wood ash that would obscure the decorations. But then we also have a smaller kiln that we fire with gas and wood together, that has similar effects as the big kiln, but in our big kiln we have like tons of different zones that have, some are more oxidized, some more reduced, and different temperature ranges, and so we have a bunch of different glazes that work really well in all of those different places. And in our little kiln we kind of have to focus in a little bit more and decide if we're going to have it be more generally oxidized or more generally reduced. And for now, when we can't have lots of people coming over helping fire the big kiln, we're just firing the little kiln. And so we're just doing that a couple of times this week to try and get ready for some of our upcoming shows.
That's a great option to have too, you know, like a secondary kind of just system for getting things out more quickly. So that's really helpful. So.
Yeah, that's the original reason that we built it, was to be able to do more testing where you're not testing something totally new on like 600 pots. So we can fire that in really different ways. We can also do it in between the big firings if we realize we just need a few more sets of dinner plates or something. It's also a kiln that we make available to our apprentices whenever they want to fire their own work. They can have total free reign of that kiln. And you only need like 2 people to fire it, which turned out to be really handy when we first had kids, and now in a pandemic.
How many helpers do you normally have with the big kiln?
With that kiln, we'll go in shifts.
Mhm.
At the end of the firing, when we need the most help, we usually have about 5 or 6 people at a time. I mean, all together. And then before that, we'll have had maybe 2 or 3. Well, probably about 3 or 4 other people that have had shifts before that last shift.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much work. I mean, it's really awesome to sort of see in the social media posts how much process is happening, and the results of that all being kind of worked into the finished product of the pieces is it's really a great window into what you guys are making that you're portraying.
Well, it's a lot of fun.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, it is a lot of work, but also, especially once we get to the firing part and all the pots are loaded and we're all doing it, that's, I think anybody that has helped out with the wood firing knows that it's a pretty fun process once you get to that part.
Nice. Well, so I've asked also for people to kind of talk about a piece of work that they're inspired by, or another, a pot or something that you have that you would like to show us. Do you have something around? Let's see.
Although that proved to be a very difficult.
I'm sure just one thing, right?
I ran up to the house before this interview, like maybe 15 minutes, like, oh, just gonna go grab a pot, and then I was like, very hard decision. But I ended up grabbing this pot, which is one that we use almost every day. It is by a potter in Wisconsin named Willem Gebben. And the reason I chose it was that, I think the reason I chose it is that we use it pretty much every single day for tea, and it is just a very approachable pot. It's one that in a lineup of like all my favorite pots might not catch my eye like immediately, but I think I'm kind of interested in just sort of giving a plug to these like really simple pots that can be a part of our lives. And I think that, and that isn't to say that we're not totally inspired by and enjoy even making kind of more sculptural objects. But I think one of the things that is really unique about pottery as an art form is that not only are we exploring a language that all art explores of line and form and color, but there's also this amazing opportunity for this sort of physical interaction and the tactile sense of how heavy it is and what the handle feels like and what the surface of the clay is like. And that is, sometimes we're like literally even putting our mouths on it. But that is a really kind of unique aesthetic experience. I think that's why we love creative exploration through art, is that it's an opportunity to express things and communicate things in so many other ways other than words. And these are objects, and this one in particular in our family, is something that we've used countless times, most of the time without even really thinking. So that's another aspect of it, is how we perceive an object. Is it like through a contemplative experience? Is it something that we only get to see once in a museum, or something that's in our house, or something that we get to hold? All of these are great, by the way. I'm not trying to make any kind of value judgment, but so this pot has also just collected over the years like this meaning of it just sort of accompanying us through our daily lives. And so many objects can do that, but this is one of them for me, and I really like it.
Yeah, and like what you said is real, right? Like the intimacy of these objects for me is the thing that is so special. And I mean, there's so many examples of paintings I love or of sculptural forms that I love, but like I don't touch them. They don't touch my mouth. Like I mean, and to begin to consider what it means to hold the aesthetic object, to interact with it on a physical level, I think is where the sort of like the magic of pots happens, right? I mean, so it's like not only is it exciting and amazing to look at, and it hits all these spots of like aesthetic kind of preferences or directions or ideas, but it becomes like part of your activity in your life, and you take it with you, and you consume things out of it, and it's like a vehicle for living in a way. And that that never gets old to me, like I don't make a ton of pots right now as an artist, but like I using pots is like a very major part of my life that I would be incredibly sad to not have. And yeah, it's awesome to hear you talk about one that is so near and dear to you, and to have an example of it here. So
Yeah,
thanks for sharing that with us.
great question.
Well, so I'm going to list, Naomi, your social media handles and website and everything so people can see that. Are there any upcoming shows that we should mention that people can check out too?
Sure, yeah. We are getting ready right now for we usually go up to Minnesota for the St. Croix Pottery Tour on Mother's Day weekend, which is an amazing event I mean, even for us, if we weren't participating as potters selling our work, it's kind of an amazing pottery pilgrimage to go to, hopefully at some point.
Yeah.
But this year, of course, it's not happening in person, and everybody is doing it online. So everybody's going to be who would have been going online sales, and some are doing virtual pottery appointments in their showrooms. And so we're going to be doing that on Mother's Day weekend. But I also it's a great opportunity for anybody interested in pottery or studying pottery to get to see that collection of makers, because it is a really great group. So not just us, but a really wonderful, I think there's 50 or 60 people involved in that.
Yeah, it's an incredible event.
Yeah.
Do people go to your website on that time to like see the work there? Okay.
Yeah, we'll have an online sale that will be going live on May 8th at
Okay.
11 a.m. Eastern time. And then we're starting to schedule appointments for people that want to do like a virtual shopping tour of our showroom on the following Saturday and Sunday.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I will put those links up as well. Naomi, thanks so much for taking time to chat with us today. It's been really, really wonderful catching up with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.
Awesome. Okay.